Good day to everyone watching. Today we will be learning who Jose E. Marcos is and what are his contributions to the Philippine historiography. My name is Princess Nia and let me tell you the story of Mr. Marco and why he is relevant. Jose A. Marcos is a Filipino collector and contributor of historical documents in the early 20th century. He played a significant role in Philippine historiography because he provided materials that were believed to describe pre-Hispanic Filipino society. His works influenced historians and were even used in textbooks. He presented several types of documents, including bark manuscripts, supposedly ancient writings on bark trees, Spanish-era reports, the Povedano manuscript, Pavon manuscript, and the Code of Datu Calantiao. They were accepted by scholars because it filled gaps in pre-Hispanic Philippine history, and at the time, they were eager for some fresh new information. Lastly, his documents seem detailed and convincing. However, later analysis by William Henry Scott revealed that many of these documents were likely fabricated, making his role controversial.
Firstly, Reseña Histórica de la Isla de Negros is a document associated with Jose E. Marco that claims to present a historical narrative of Negros Island. It describes early settlements, local rulers, and events before and during the early Spanish period. This document attempts to give a continuous story of how society in Negros developed, including the interactions between the indigenous leaders and incoming Spanish authorities. Because of this, it appeared to fill an important gap in Philippine regional history, especially for areas that lack written records. However, when William Henry Scott examined it, he noticed that the document had no clear provenance, meaning there was no verifiable origin, archive, or original copy that could prove its authenticity. It existed mainly through Marco's claim. Scott also observed that some of the details in the text did not match the known historical facts from verified Spanish records. Certain events and descriptions seemed inconsistent or unsupported by the other sources. Because historians rely on cross-checking untraceable origins, the absence of this made the document highly questionable. Scott concluded that while the Reseña tried to present itself as a legitimate historical account, it could not be trusted due to its uncertain origin and inconsistencies, suggesting that it may not be an authentic source of history.
So the second one is the three bark documents. These were presented by Marco and claimed to be a pre-Hispanic writings with bark. If they were real, they would be very valuable because only a few written records from pre-Hispanic Philippines still exist. The documents supposedly showed information about early life of a Filipino, such as customs, beliefs, and the early writing systems of Filipino before Spanish colonizations. Because of this, many historians were interested since it proved that Filipino already had a developed systems of writing and record keeping. However, William Henry Scott found several problems. First, the writings did not match the known script like by Bible. Second, the language is not consistent with the time. Third, there's no proof that the bark was actually old. Also, some parts are too modern and out of it. That's called anachronism. Because of these issues, Scott concluded that the pre-Hispanic artifacts were not real. So, instead of becoming a valuable source, they became an example of how artifacts or pre-Hispanic evidence can be faked.
The next one is one of Marcus's many manuscripts, the Povedano manuscripts. These manuscripts is a collection of documents that are claimed to date back in the 16th century during the Spanish colonization in the Philippines. These manuscripts supposedly provide detailed information about Filipino history at the time, including descriptions of local customs, social structures, and interaction amongst the Spanish officials. They present themselves as first-hand records that would make them valuable information during the Spanish colonial history. The manuscripts attempt to describe how Filipinos lived, how the communities are organized, and how they responded to Spanish influence. Because of this, they were initially seen as important historical sources that could give insight into a period of limited resources. However, Scott found several issues. He analyzed the language used in the manuscripts and discovered that it did not match the language of Spanish in the 16th century. Certain words, grammar, and expressions appeared to belong to a later time period. This suggests that the documents were not actually written when they were meant to be. In addition, some of the historical details in the manuscripts did not align with the verified records. Events was described in ways that conflicted with no timelines, and some informations were seemed inaccurate and exaggerated. Furthermore, like other Marco documents, the Povedano manuscripts lacked a clear and verifiable source, making it impossible to trace their authenticity.
Von manuscript presented by Marco claimed to describe early Philippine history including leaders, law, tradition, and suggests that pre-colonial Filipinos had organized political systems. They are especially important because they are the source of the Code of Kalinchao. However, historian William Henry Scott found serious issues. He noticed similarities between this and other Marco documents, including repeated style and errors. He also identified anachronisms, meaning details in the manuscript did not match the same time period they claimed to describe. Another major problem is that no original copies exist, only version provided by Marco, so they cannot be independently verified. Because of these issues, Scott concluded that the Pavan manuscripts are likely fabricated and also make the Code of Kalinchao unreliable.
So the last one, the most controversial and famous document by Mr. Marco, the Code of Dato Kalansiao. It claims to be a set of laws created in 1433 by a ruler named Kalansiao. The code describes a system of strict rules and punishment, suggesting that pre-Hispanic Filipinos had a formal and organized legal system. The laws in the code include a severe punishment for various offenses, such as disobedience, disrespect, or violence of social norms. Because of this, the code has widely accepted as proof that early Filipino society was highly structured and disciplined. It even became part of school textbook and national history. However, Scott's investigation revealed serious problems. First, there is no historical evidence that Kalansiao ever existed. His name does not appear in any verified historical record or oral tradition or archaeological findings. Second, the code itself has no original pre-Hispanic copy and only appear in the Pavon manuscript, which are already questionable. Scott also noted that the structure and style of the laws seemed influenced by later legal system, making them unlikely to have originated in the 15th century. The combination of missing evidence, questionable source, and inconsistencies led Scott to conclude that the Code of Kalansiao is a completely historical hoax.
Through his investigations, William Henry Scott's critic greatly changed the understandings of Philippine pre-Hispanic history by exposing that many widely accepted sources, especially those provided by Jose E. Marco, were unreliable or fabricated.
This forced historians to reevaluate earlier beliefs, removing false information, leading to a more accurate and evidence-based interpretations of the past.
At the same time, Marco's case contributed to improving historical methodology by highlighting the importance of verifying sources through provenance, language analysis, and comparison with credible records.
They must remain skeptical of sources without clear origins, avoid being influenced by bias or the desire for a more impressive history, and always prioritize truth and evidence.
One key insight from this chapter is that historical research can be deceptive because they may appear authentic and convincing even when they are not, which means historians must look beyond the surface and examine how and why a source was created. This is why provenance is essential in historical research as it provides the full background of a document, its origin, creator, and history, allowing historians to determine whether it is genuine or not. Without this context, a source cannot be properly evaluated. At the same time, historians must balance openness to new resources with critical skepticism by being willing to consider new information while carefully testing its credibility, consistency, and context before accepting it as true. This approach ensures that historical knowledge continues to grow without sacrificing accuracy and reliability.